The courtroom echoed with laughter. Senator John Neely Kennedy had just delivered one of his trademark barbs, this time at the expense of a young legal scholar attempting to explain the nuances of the First Amendment. Cameras captured the smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth, the murmurs of agreement from aligned colleagues, the viral moment forming in real time. His voice, syrupy with Southern charm and lined with academic sharpness, had become a weapon in Washington, crafted to ridicule, designed to win sound bites. "Well, that's a mighty interesting theory, Professor," Kennedy drawled, eyes twinkling with mischief. "But it seems you've confused the Constitution with a college newsletter." Laughter erupted. It was sharp, almost cruel. The young expert shrank a little in her seat, blinking fast, searching for composure. And that's when it happened. A slow movement from the back corner of the hearing room, a hand rising, tremulous but purposeful, fingers spotted with age, raised in silence. The courtroom, still chuckling moments before, turned toward the interruption. Security shifted uneasily. The chair recognized the gesture, then looked again, eyebrows lifting in disbelief. "Professor Walter Elridge," the chair announced, voice steadying. "Here on request of the Judiciary Committee." Kennedy's head jerked up. There he was. Frail, yes, but still formidable. Tweed jacket draped over shoulders slightly bent by time, a leather satchel by his feet, clasp still unbuckled. His eyes, however, were unchanged, piercing blue, calm, unreadable. If you're captivated by political drama with real stakes and unforgettable twists, don't forget to subscribe now so you never miss a gripping story like this one. Senator Kennedy's throat tightened, invisible to the cameras, but instantly felt in the shift of his body. He recognized the man instantly. The same professor whose class he once feared more than finals. Walter Elridge, the legend from Tulane. The man who could dismantle a legal argument with a raised eyebrow. The chair gestured. "Professor, if you would..." Elridge rose slowly. He didn't need to tap his cane for silence. He simply stood, and the room fell quiet. "Before I begin," he said, voice like gravel over oak, "I'd like to address something Senator Kennedy said." Kennedy leaned back slightly, arms folding across his chest. His trademark smile didn't appear. "In your remarks," Elridge continued, "you implied the First Amendment can be understood with cleverness and wit. But, sir, wit is not wisdom, and the Constitution is not a tool for entertainment." A few gasps whispered across the room. Elridge turned to the young scholar Kennedy had mocked. "And I commend this young expert for attempting, under difficult circumstances, to explain a principle we once discussed at length in my classroom." The room, moments ago a stage for Kennedy's rhetorical gymnastics, now held its breath. Kennedy spoke, carefully measured. "Professor Elridge, always an honor. I assume you're here to enlighten us on the finer points of free speech law." "I'm here," Elridge said gently, "to remind us what law is for." The words landed not with force, but with weight. Kennedy, caught between deflection and defense, offered nothing. And for the first time that morning, the hearing room was silent. Not out of boredom or protocol, but anticipation. The professor lifted his papers. The cameras turned, and the stage that once belonged to Kennedy now shifted subtly toward the man who had taught him everything he knew and everything he had chosen to forget. The courtroom remained still, every eye on Professor Elridge as he adjusted his glasses and unfolded a single page of notes. He didn't posture or perform. He read softly, as if the words were meant for a seminar room rather than a national stage. "In 1975, he began, "a student entered my class with ambition in his eyes and a question already forming on his lips. That student was John Neely Kennedy." Kennedy didn't flinch, but a muscle twitched beneath his right eye. He was bright, Elridge said plainly, blazingly so, but impatient. He wanted answers that made sense quickly. He mistook clarity for truth. There was no ridicule in his tone, no malice, just the weight of memory. In a courtroom full of analysts and lawyers, the sudden shift to personal recollection felt disorienting. But Elridge continued, weaving past and present with quiet authority. "I remember a debate," he said, his voice warming. "It was on Brandenburg versus Ohio. Mr. Kennedy, John, argued that the ruling gave too much power to protesters. He feared disorder. I argued that the ruling protected dissent from the tyranny of comfort." Kennedy's fingers tapped the desk once, then stopped. "You see," Elridge continued, "freedom of speech isn't designed to protect what's agreeable. It exists precisely to protect what makes us uncomfortable. That's not theory, that's constitutional law." Murmurs stirred among the aides behind him. Kennedy shifted in his seat, but made no move to interrupt. The room, once brimming with smug delight, now felt like a classroom in suspended animation, the kind of space where learning still seemed possible. Elridge turned to the young scholar seated nearby. "Miss Garrison, you referenced Justice Holmes. You were correct. The marketplace of ideas is not about cleverness winning. It's about truth emerging over time, even from unlikely voices." The young woman nodded, lips parting slightly in astonishment. This wasn't a rescue, it was a recognition. Elridge's eyes swept the room again. "When I taught John," he argued passionately, "he was never cruel, only careless with certainty. But that carelessness, when unchecked, grows dangerous. It becomes easy to score points, harder to make meaning." A flicker of emotion crossed Kennedy's face, too fleeting to name. Elridge closed the note and placed it aside. "Senators," he said, "the First Amendment is not a shield for mockery. It is a contract with the soul of a nation. It demands more of us than cleverness." The silence following his words wasn't stunned, it was thoughtful. The hearing room had shifted. What began as another skirmish in the culture war had become something different, something heavier. Kennedy leaned forward, voice composed. "Professor, I don't recall that particular exchange, but I appreciate your historical perspective." "You wouldn't," Elridge replied kindly. "It wasn't remarkable at the time, but some lessons remain long after memory fades." Kennedy let the silence hold for a beat before responding. "You taught me how to lose an argument gracefully. I suppose I'm relearning it now." The edges of Elridge's lips turned upward, almost a smile. "Then I haven't wasted my morning." The moment passed like a breeze, quiet, unforced. The chair cleared his throat. "Please proceed with your analysis, Professor Elridge." As he turned to the matter at hand, citing precedents and articulating the legal ramifications of the case before them, the courtroom followed every word. But beneath it all, something deeper had begun. A quiet reckoning, not just with law but with legacy. And for John Neely Kennedy, the echo of old lessons was becoming harder to ignore. Professor Elridge's voice gained strength as he moved through the legal framework of the First Amendment, his cadence precise, each reference intentional. He spoke not to impress but to clarify, citing precedents with the ease of a man who had spent a lifetime studying their meaning. "New York Times Cumber versus Sullivan," he said, "reminded us that public debate must be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. But that ruling was never a license to distort or degrade. It was a safeguard against government retaliation, not a cloak for cruelty." Eyes shifted back to Kennedy, whose expression had settled into something unreadable. Not defensive, but not open either. It was the face of a man recalculating, unsure whether he stood in the middle of a skirmish or at the edge of something larger. Elridge moved next to Texas versus Johnson. "Even the burning of the flag," he said, "was protected as symbolic speech. Why? Because our Constitution doesn't ask if something is tasteful. It asks whether it's free." That landed heavily. Then came the pivot. Elridge glanced briefly at his notes, but his next words came not from the page but memory. In a paper John submitted during his second year, he wrote, "Freedom without discipline is just noise." I underlined that sentence 3 times. A murmur stirred. Kennedy blinked. That line had long vanished from his own recollection. "You understood then," Elridge continued, "that rights require responsibility. But over time, politics seduces us into weaponizing our intellect. You were never unwise, John, but you've grown too comfortable dismissing what you once questioned." Kennedy raised his head. His voice, when it came, was even. "Professor, with respect, these hearings are not lectures. The stakes are national. I'm not a student anymore." "No," Elridge said quietly, "but the law still teaches." The air had changed again. The early edge of confrontation now deepened into something more profound, an unveiling, not of scandal, but of character. Elridge leaned slightly forward. "You once told me, in office hours, that your greatest fear was being thought of as foolish, that you covered it with jokes because mockery felt safer than mistake." A collective inhale passed through the room. "I did," Kennedy admitted softly before catching himself. "That was a long time ago." Elridge nodded. "It was. But fear, if left unchecked, becomes habit." There was no triumph in his tone, no glee. It wasn't a rebuke. It was an invitation. Kennedy's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, then paused. The silence pressed, not hostile but heavy. Finally he said, "So what would you have me do, Professor? Apologize for having a sharp tongue?" No, Elridge replied. But perhaps remember that every word you speak here echoes further than you think. Some sharpen, some wound. Some can still illuminate. It wasn't a reprimand, it was a challenge and a choice. Kennedy looked down at his notepad, the carefully scripted questions now irrelevant. He tapped his pen once. Then again, he didn't speak. Elridge sat back. The room had no clear hero now, no winner, just the quiet presence of truth, stretching into the corners, reshaping the shape of the conversation. And though no one said it aloud, something had cracked. Not publicly, not with headlines or hashtags, but in the deep place where conviction lives. The part of a person that knows when they've been seen and fears it most. For several long seconds, the room remained suspended in stillness. No questions, no objections, just the quiet hum of something shifting beneath the surface. Kennedy tapped his pen again, slower this time, the sound oddly rhythmic in the stillness. Elridge didn't press forward. He waited. Kennedy cleared his throat. Professor, I've sat in this chair for years. I've cross-examined judges, grilled cabinet members, and sparred with legal scholars. I've heard every argument dressed up in ivory tower elegance. But you cut different. Elridge offered no reply. Kennedy leaned forward slightly. You said I was afraid to look foolish. Maybe that's still true, but I'm not here to impress you. I'm here to do my job. Then do it, Elridge replied. But ask yourself what that job truly is. Kennedy stared at him, no longer posturing. Do you think I've forgotten everything you taught me? I think you've buried it under performance. That landed not as insult, but as clarity. Kennedy looked down, the edges of his showman's smile gone. The room, sensing the tonal shift, leaned in. I learned from you, he said slowly. But I also learned how this place works. Out here, nuance gets drowned out by sound bites. They don't air the careful parts, Professor. Just the barbs. Then maybe it's time, Elridge said softly. You stop speaking for airtime and start speaking for purpose. For the first time, Kennedy didn't counter. He considered. This hearing was supposed to be about a policy, Kennedy said almost to himself. Now it's become something else. No, Elridge said. It always was about something else. It's about the soul of how we govern. You just forgot. Kennedy's gaze lifted, and something settled in his posture, less combative, more reflective. He looked at the young scholar he had mocked earlier, her notebook now full but her expression unreadable. I owe you an apology, he said, quiet but clear. Your argument was sound. I didn't listen. I reacted. The room froze. Kennedy rarely admitted fault, let alone publicly, but the words didn't tremble. They landed. The young woman blinked, caught between confusion and dignity. Thank you, Senator. Kennedy turned back to Elridge. You still teaching? No, Elridge answered, but I haven't stopped hoping. Kennedy nodded once. He scanned his notes, tossed aside a page, then asked a question, not a rhetorical jab, but a sincere inquiry. Professor, in your view, what's the most misunderstood aspect of the First Amendment in our current political climate? Elridge smiled, not smugly, but with something close to pride. That it guarantees truth. It doesn't. It guarantees the right to search for it. Kennedy wrote that down. No cameras zoomed in, but everyone noticed. Something unusual had taken root. A senator known for derision was now listening. A professor thought retired had re-entered the forum as a force of reckoning. And somewhere in the exchange, the lines between arrogance and honesty had blurred. The chair of the committee shifted forward, ready to regain procedural control, but paused. There was something sacred in the moment, an actual conversation. Kennedy spoke again, not to attack, but to learn. If our words carry weight beyond the chamber, what do we owe to those who hear them? Elridge answered without hesitation. Clarity, courage, and care. Kennedy didn't nod. He absorbed it. The hearings continued, but the tone had changed. The courtroom, once a theater, now felt more like a crucible, refining, reshaping, real. And behind every exchange, one question echoed, who are we, when we stop performing? The final moments of the hearing approached, yet no one moved to end it. Something unspoken held them, an awareness that this day had stepped beyond policy or party lines. It had become a mirror. Professor Elridge closed his binder. His hands rested calmly on the table. He did not summarize. He reflected. When I first began teaching, he said, I believed law was about rules. Later I understood it was about people. And now I believe it's about memory. the kind we shape as a country. The room didn't stir. Even the reporters, hungry for headlines, seemed content to absorb. Our freedoms are loud, Elridge continued. They shout, they protest, they clash. But underneath them all is a quiet responsibility. Not to silence others, but to understand them. He paused. His eyes found Kennedy's. It is easy to speak. It is harder to listen. And hardest still to change. Kennedy didn't smile. He met the professor's gaze, and for the first time all day there was no armor between them. Just acknowledgement. "Thank you, Professor," Kennedy said, voice low, almost hoarse. "For this and for everything else." Elridge nodded once. "You were always capable. You just needed reminding." The chair moved to adjourn, but Kennedy raised a hand. "One last comment," he said. The room tensed, unsure what would follow. Kennedy turned to the gallery. "Many of you came today expecting sparks. Another political skirmish, maybe a soundbite. I came ready to deliver one. I thought that was my job." He let the silence expand. "But what I got was a correction. Maybe even a lesson I didn't know I still needed. I've asked questions in these chambers for years. Today I received one worth answering." The audience, once tense, now softened. "I don't know if I'll change overnight, but I do know this. Words matter. And mine should do more than provoke. They should serve." He looked at the young scholar again. "Thank you for your patience." She nodded, overwhelmed but steady. Then, turning back to Elridge, he said, "You once told me the law is a bridge between minds. Today, you walked across it first." Elridge didn't respond. He didn't need to. The gavel struck. The hearing was adjourned. But as the room emptied, people lingered. Staffers exchanged glances. Reporters held their breath before filing stories. It wasn't just what had been said. It was how. In the corridor, Kennedy walked beside Elridge. No cameras followed. No statements were made. Just an old professor and his former student, talking again, not as symbols but as men. Later someone would ask Kennedy about the moment. He'd shrug and say, "Sometimes you remember who you were and realize you still have time to become him again." That quote would travel far. And for once it wouldn't be laughed at. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. And click the next video on screen to dive deeper into the unseen dramas of American power. There's always more to uncover when we're ready to listen.